Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At Thanksgiving, my sister rolled her eyes and said, "Some of us actually work for a living." Grandpa didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice or blink. He just turned to me with that same slow, knowing look he's had since Vietnam, the kind of look that cuts through every layer of bullshit, and asked, "So your company acquiring hers was just charity?" The silence that followed wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. It sliced right through the mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce and straight into the thick, simmering tension that had been building between me and Rachel for the last 2 decades. But to understand how we got there, sitting around Mom's long oak table with the smell of turkey still heavy in the air and everyone frozen like mannequins, you need to go back a little further. Because none of this happened overnight. It never does in families like mine. I'd pulled up to my parents' house that afternoon in my usual understated black Audi, which of course Rachel would later call Lauren's tiny Batmobile. The driveway was already crowded with her boyfriend's loud-ass pickup, my dad's aging sedan, and Mom's white Lexus that hadn't been washed since August. I sat there for a second with my hands still on the wheel, watching the front door, bracing myself. Holidays in our family have always been performative, smiles a little too tight, compliments a little too forced, hugs that last exactly 2 seconds longer than comfort allows. There's no slamming doors or screaming matches in our family. Just precision-guided guilt and passive-aggressive fireworks dressed as polite conversation. I stepped inside, carrying 2 pies from a boutique bakery I'd stopped at on the way. Mom swooped in with a hug that smelled like perfume and turkey skin and said, "You didn't have to bring anything, sweetie. Rachel's already made everything from scratch this year," like it was some Olympic feat. Rachel, standing near the kitchen island in a flour-dusted apron that I'm 99% sure she put on just for effect, looked up and gave me that sideways smile she's perfected. It's the kind that says, "I tolerate you because I have to." She didn't say hello. Just nodded toward the pies and said, "From a store, right?" Thought so. Some of us didn't have time to shop, what with having to run an actual business. Then she went back to basting the turkey like she was starring in a Thanksgiving-themed episode of her own cooking show. I didn't answer. I just placed the pies on the counter and asked Mom if the guest room still had blackout curtains. When you've known someone your entire life, you learn how to read the insults between the lines. And Rachel had a PhD in backhanded compliments. Dinner started off civil enough. My dad gave his usual toast about gratitude, delivered with the same monotone voice he uses to narrate church fundraisers. Rachel sat next to her new boyfriend, Jake, a personal trainer/entrepreneur, who spent most of the meal talking about how fasting is the future of medicine. Across from me sat Grandpa Walter, who has always had zero patience for small talk and even less for fools. The man fought in real wars and didn't flinch during chemo, so Rachel's bragging about Instagram reach was never going to impress him. We made it through the appetizers, a painfully long rundown of Rachel's business updates. We're in talks with a new beverage brand, just expanded into Atlanta, and several not-so-subtle references to how real hustle doesn't look like sitting in meetings all day. I bit the inside of my cheek and sipped my wine. I didn't need to defend myself. Not yet. The thing is, no one at that table knew the truth. They didn't know that 2 months ago, my company, an actual mid-sized player in the software infrastructure space, acquired Rachel's boutique PR firm through a third-party buyout. They didn't know that she'd been hemorrhaging clients for over a year and took a silent investor's offer to stay afloat. And they definitely didn't know that I had been that investor. Well, not directly. The paperwork had been crafted so cleanly that Rachel had no idea her big sister now technically owned her livelihood. But Grandpa suspected. He always did. The tipping point came during dessert, when someone mentioned the economy, and Rachel, full of Pinot Noir and misplaced confidence, sighed dramatically and said, "Well, some of us actually work for a living. You wouldn't understand, Lauren." I felt the eyes swing toward me like spotlights. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just tilted my glass slightly, watching the light catch the rim. Then Grandpa leaned forward, wiped his hands on a napkin, and asked it with perfect timing, "So your company acquiring hers was just charity?" Like a scalpel through layered cake. No one breathed. Not my parents. Not Jake the gym guru. Not even Rachel, whose face lost every trace of color like someone had pulled the plug. Her eyes started around the table. She looked at Mom, then Dad, and then finally me. I just raised my eyebrows slightly and gave her the tiniest smile I could manage without being obvious. It was the smile of someone who just watched her checkmate land after 5 moves of silent strategy. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips trembled like she wanted to shout or scream or cry, but she couldn't choose which one. And suddenly, all the air in the room seemed to disappear. The turkey smelled sour. The candles flickered harder. Even the dog lying under the table let out a groan like it knew this night had just gone somewhere it couldn't follow. But me? I just sat back and let the silence do the work. Because sometimes, revenge doesn't need volume. Sometimes, it just needs timing. It had started, as many things in business do, with a numbers problem, lines on a balance sheet that didn't line up with the image being curated on Instagram, a stack of reports that hinted at collapse disguised as growth, and a series of red flags that any seasoned executive would recognize as the beginning of a slow, painful corporate death. When my team brought Rachel's agency to my attention, it wasn't because they knew she was my sister. In fact, the irony is that if her name hadn't been changed after a failed rebrand, the whole acquisition probably wouldn't have happened at all. But her company, Aurora Communications, because apparently someone once told her that abstract names make a firm look modern, landed on our radar like any other struggling agency trying to survive in a saturated market, and in that moment, I made a decision that would eventually reshape everything between us. I didn't tell them to back off. I told them to dig deeper. The reports were almost comical in their optimism. I saw pitch decks filled with phrases like next-gen synergy and 360 branding experience and empowering emotional storytelling, all of which read like someone had mashed together every startup buzzword from the last 5 years and wrapped them in pastel gradients and stock images of laughing women in co-working spaces. But the finances told a different story. They revealed unpaid invoices, client churn rates in the red zone, 2 major accounts lost in the same quarter, and a 5-figure tax debt quietly deferred through a shell LLC. From where I sat, with a team of analysts trained to spot weakness before it goes public, Rachel's empire was not only crumbling, it had already cracked wide open. The only thing holding it up was appearance. And appearances don't last long in this world. I'll admit, when I realized it was her, I hesitated. There was a long moment, sitting in my glass-walled corner office on the 30th floor, when I stared at the portfolio and wondered whether I should recuse myself. It felt too personal, too pointed. We hadn't spoken outside of holidays and birthday group texts in almost 2 years, and even when we did, it was the kind of surface-level exchange that left both of us feeling emptier than before. But something about the situation hooked me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was ego. Maybe it was the darker part of me, the part that remembered every time she rolled her eyes when I spoke at dinner, every time she dismissed what I did as just meetings and spreadsheets, every time she managed to turn her failings into proof that I was somehow privileged, robotic, lucky. Whatever it was, I didn't walk away. I leaned in. The acquisition itself wasn't difficult. When you have the right lawyers and the right shell entities, you can buy a business without ever showing your face. We moved through a private equity firm we occasionally used for minor consolidations, and I gave the directive to approach Aurora as if it were any other small agency with creative potential but poor execution. Rachel never stood a chance. She was desperate for cash flow and blinded by the idea that someone wanted to save her business. In the official meetings, she pitched herself with the energy of someone who still believed the dream was alive. She spoke about expansion into lifestyle branding, of international reach, of pivoting into influencer management. It was all fluff. My team nodded politely, the way wolves might nod at a deer explaining how strong her legs are. The deal was signed in under 6 weeks. She never knew. And that, I admit, was intentional. I didn't want her to know. Not yet. Because I wasn't looking for applause or confrontation. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for at the time. Maybe I just wanted her to owe me something for once, even if she never knew she did. Or maybe I wanted to watch how she carried herself when the person she despised the most was secretly the one holding her safety net. There was something quietly powerful about the idea of letting her gloat, letting her throw her barbs across the table at family gatherings, letting her live inside the illusion of her own independence while I signed the checks keeping her lights on. But it wasn't just business. There was a moment, 2 days after the ink dried on the acquisition, when I sat at my kitchen island, half a glass of wine in hand, and pulled up her personal Instagram account. The one where she posted photos of overpriced lattes and branded notebooks and inspirational quotes about rising women lifting others. She had just uploaded a picture of her office with the caption, "Surround yourself with those who believe in your vision. Loyalty and love equals growth." The irony nearly knocked me over. Because the office in that picture, the one with the fiddle-leaf fig in the corner and the trendy exposed brick wall, was now technically mine. And the only reason she could pay rent on it that month was because I had decided to cut a six-figure check into her account via a backdoor line item in a holding firm's quarterly disbursement. Loyalty and love, indeed. And then there was the Jeremy detail. That one came later, almost by accident. While reviewing the agency's investor history, a name popped up: J. Miller Holdings. At first, I thought nothing of it. But the more I stared at it, the more it stuck. I made a call to a friend in private finance and asked them to run it quietly. The result made my stomach twist. Jeremy Miller. My ex-husband. The same man who, after our divorce 5 years ago, swore he wanted nothing more than to stay away from the chaos of my family and start fresh in Florida. He had been funding Rachel's agency in secret for at least a year. Not much, just enough to make her think she had options. Just enough to keep her from sinking too fast. I didn't even feel betrayed. I felt insulted. Like they'd both assumed I'd never find out. Like they thought I wouldn't look. I sat with that information for a long time. I didn't call him. I didn't call her. I didn't scream or cry or send one of those emotionally raw emails that people write and delete and rewrite again. Instead, I made a note in my file, updated the internal communications guidelines, and poured myself another glass of wine. Because this wasn't about Jeremy. And it wasn't about the money. It was about control. And I'd just taken hers without her even noticing. Let her boast, I thought. Let her keep posting those self-congratulatory updates. Let her play queen in a crumbling castle. Because someday soon, the truth would land. And when it did, I wanted to be close enough to see the look on her face. Not to laugh. Not even to gloat. Just to remember. Just to know that after all those years of her dismissing me, of acting like I'd had it easy, like she was the real fighter, I had won. Quietly. Completely. And she hadn't even seen it coming. Long before the deal was done, before the legal documents were signed under the sterile light of a midtown law office, before Rachel's business landed in my hands without her even knowing it, there was a house with beige walls, outdated curtains, and 2 daughters growing up side by side in a world that was always tilted slightly in her favor, though no one ever admitted it aloud. If you had asked anyone back then, neighbors, teachers, even our own parents, they would have told you we were close, that we got along, that we were just different kinds of girls, as if that explained the gaping void that had always existed between us. The kind of quiet competition that doesn't need words or direct conflict to exist, only time, silence, and a lifetime of small comparisons that no one thinks are cruel when they're said with a smile. Rachel was the pretty one. That was the label she got early, before we were even old enough to understand what that meant. She had the curly blonde hair and the high cheekbones and the dimples that made strangers coo in grocery store lines. She was the one mom put in pastel dresses for family photos, the one who got away with skipping chores because she had a dance recital or was going through something. She was chaos wrapped in charm, and people forgave her everything: missed curfews, C- report cards, emotional explosions over broken nail polish bottles, because that's what happens when a girl is pretty and difficult. People assume she must be special. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the serious one, the one who never forgot her homework and got straight A's without needing help, the one who cleaned up after the dog and didn't complain when dinner was late. I was called mature for my age, which was a polite way of saying I'd learned early that there wasn't room for my emotions. In a house already full of hers. Our childhood wasn't cruel, exactly. There was food on the table, birthday cakes every year, and a backyard with a trampoline we both jumped on until one of us ended up in tears. But there was always this undercurrent, this sense that Rachel was the center of gravity and the rest of us orbited around her. Dad adored her in the way quiet men sometimes adore loud daughters. They don't understand them, but they'll defend them with quiet, immovable loyalty. Mom tried to stay neutral, but she always stepped in when Rachel cried and stayed silent when I did. It was Grandpa Walter who saw through it all, the only one in the family who didn't buy the performance. He didn't say much, but when he did, it landed like a hammer. I remember once, when Rachel accused me of being cold and too perfect, he looked up from his newspaper and said, "She's not cold. She just doesn't need to perform to be worthy of your attention." Rachel didn't speak to him for a week after that. I loved him a little more. From that day on. College was when the distance became official. I went to the University of Chicago on partial scholarship, majoring in economics and interning every summer like my life depended on it. Rachel floated through community college, dropped out, worked at a yoga studio for a while, traveled with a boyfriend to Costa Rica for 6 months, came back, and declared she was going to start her own PR firm because she just knew people. And she did know people. I'll give her that. Rachel could walk into a room and have 3 strangers wrapped around her finger in under 5 minutes. But knowing people and knowing what to do with them are 2 different skill sets, and one of them fades fast without structure, funding, or strategy. Still, our parents clapped for her every move like she was building the next Google. Every time she opened a new client or hosted some influencer mixer with free cocktails and gift bags, they acted like she'd changed the world. I, meanwhile, was still the one no one quite understood. I'd started my company out of an apartment in Queens, working 90-hour weeks, eating dinner at my desk while managing 2 developers and a marketing intern. There was no celebration when I got my first series of funding. No champagne when we closed our first $1 million deal. I told Mom once over the phone, and she just said, "That's great, honey. You should call your sister, she's feeling down." That was the year I stopped sharing my wins. Not because I didn't want to, but because I realized no one in my family saw them as real. And maybe that's why the discovery about Jeremy hit differently. When I found out that my ex-husband, the man who had once told me I was intimidating and emotionally unavailable after I didn't cry during a couples therapy session, had been secretly investing in Rachel's failing business. That was when I realized this wasn't just about money or business or even old resentment. It was about loyalty, about the way people silently choose sides and build alliances while pretending they're neutral. Jeremy had always claimed he didn't get my family, that he felt like an outsider, that he thought Rachel was dramatic and unserious. But there he was, wiring her funds through a shell account like some kind of hero, playing the silent savior while pretending to be above it all. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. I knew what he'd say if I did, that he didn't want to see her fail, that he just wanted to help, that it wasn't about me. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe it really was about her. But that didn't change the facts. She needed him, and he stepped in. I had needed him once, too. And when I did, he told me to stop being so intense. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Rachel had always had people willing to cushion her falls. Whether it was Mom covering her credit card bill, or Dad pretending her bad behavior was just stress, or Jeremy wiring 5-figure checks in silence, there was always someone nearby ready to absorb the impact of her mistakes. Meanwhile, I'd had to learn how to fall without shattering, how to land hard and still get up like nothing happened. That kind of resilience isn't visible. It doesn't come with applause. But it does come with something better, power. And now, for the first time, I had the upper hand. She didn't know it yet. Not then. But it was coming. Because the deal was closed, the ink was dry, and her entire business was now part of a portfolio I controlled. All it would take was one wrong move, one public meltdown, one bad month, and I could end it. But I didn't want to end it. Not yet. I wanted her to grow it. I wanted her to get comfortable. I wanted her to look around and believe, for once, that everything was finally working out. Because the higher she climbed, the longer the fall. There's a particular kind of silence that fills a house on Thanksgiving morning, one that sits somewhere between anticipation and performance, a quiet stage just before the curtain rises, as if every dish in the oven, every perfectly folded napkin, every carefully chosen centerpiece is part of an unspoken script written decades ago, and no one dares to stray from their assigned role, even when the resentment simmering beneath it all threatens to seep through the cracks. I arrived early, not because I wanted to help, and certainly not because I craved more time with my family, but because I needed to see how the pieces were arranged before the rest of the players entered. Call it control, call it habit, but I've learned that if you want to navigate a minefield, you start by mapping the terrain before anyone starts walking. Rachel was already there, of course, clattering around the kitchen in designer jeans and a perfectly distressed vintage sweatshirt that looked effortless, but had probably cost more than my entire grocery list. She had a blue and white apron tied over it, not because she was cooking, most of the actual work had clearly been done the night before by Mom, but because it gave her the aesthetic she wanted to project: capable, domestic. A woman who both runs a company and makes her own stuffing from scratch. She greeted me with a quick glance, a brief upturn of the lips that could barely be called a smile, and an insincere, "Oh, you're early," like I'd intruded on something sacred. I handed Mom a bottle of wine and a pie, the same kind of offering I'd been bringing for years, the kind that says, "I'm participating," without pretending to be sentimental. Dad appeared a few minutes later, shuffling in with that tired, vaguely absent look he's worn for as long as I can remember, like he's always somewhere between pretending to care and trying to stay out of the line of fire. Grandpa Walter arrived last, leaning a little more heavily on his cane than the year before, but still with that sharpness in his eyes, that quiet calculation that never dulled no matter how old he got. The man had seen real war, had buried friends, outlived 2 wives, and somehow still noticed everything, especially the things people tried to hide. By mid-afternoon, the table was set, the turkey was resting, and Rachel had already launched into her carefully rehearsed monologue about expansion and growth projections and the new account with a wellness brand that was going to double their exposure. I recognized the pitch. I'd heard it already in boardrooms and email updates from the team I now paid to manage her flailing PR agency. The deal she was bragging about, the one she thought she had landed entirely on her own, was one of the carrots we'd quietly dangled in front of her to keep the illusion alive. The client was technically a startup owned by a holding company my firm had partial stake in, and the entire negotiation had been staged from the beginning to appear organic. We wanted to see what she'd do with it. She thought it was a victory. It was a test. I sat across from her, listening to her talk about her team and strategic vision, and I watched my parents nod with proud, oblivious faces, soaking in every overinflated number she threw at them like they were gospel. Rachel spoke with that crisp, performative tone she always used when she thought she was being impressive, the one she used at parties, on first dates, and, apparently, now at family dinners. She kept glancing in my direction, waiting for me to react, to flinch, to show some kind of envy or irritation, because that's what she thrived on, not actual success, but the appearance of superiority. She didn't care about being right. She cared about being seen as the one who had finally caught up to me. Maybe even surpassed me. I didn't give her that satisfaction. I smiled. I nodded. I asked polite questions. I made her feel like she was on stage and I was the audience, silently applauding from the shadows. And I could see it in her face, that flicker of confusion, of irritation, of not understanding why I wasn't biting. She wanted the fight. She needed the pushback. She needed me to roll my eyes or question her numbers or smirk in that way I used to when we were kids, and she told obvious lies. But I didn't. I let her keep talking. I let her dig herself in deeper. The moment she lit the fuse was so ordinary, so casual, that no one noticed at first. She was reaching for the cranberry sauce, laughing at something Jake, the boyfriend who had contributed exactly nothing to the conversation except a 5-minute tangent about intermittent fasting, had said, and then she dropped it. like a knife hidden between bread rolls. Well, some of us actually work for a living. The words landed like a slap dressed as a joke. Dad looked up from his plate. Mom's fork froze midair. Even Jake paused, sensing he'd missed something. Rachel didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at her wine glass, a half-smile playing at the corner of her lips, like she thought she was being clever. She didn't expect me to respond. She didn't think I would. She thought I'd do what I always did, stay quiet, let it pass, let her be the dramatic one. But before I could say anything, before I even registered my own reaction, Grandpa cleared his throat. He was sitting at the head of the table, hands folded, gaze steady, and his voice was calm, almost conversational, when he said, "So, Lauren, was acquiring her company just charity?" There are moments in life when time slows, not in a romantic way, not in the way movies show it, but in the way that real tension slows time, stretches every breath, every heartbeat, every rustle of cloth against wood, until the room is suspended in something heavier than silence. Rachel's mouth opened slightly, but she didn't speak. Her eyes snapped to mine, wide, confused, then flickered toward Grandpa, who remained motionless, as though he'd merely asked someone to pass the salt. Mom stammered something, a half-laugh. What do you mean?" That went unanswered. Dad looked like he was trying to pretend he didn't hear it. Jake leaned back in his chair, clearly wondering if it was too late to excuse himself. But all I did was pick up my water, take a slow sip, and then place the glass down with deliberate calm. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just met Rachel's eyes and smiled, not smugly, not cruelly, just with a kind of serene finality that told her, without words, that the game was over. Because this was the moment I'd been waiting for, not to humiliate her, not to destroy her, but to make her see. To watch her realize, in front of everyone she tried so hard to impress, that the ground beneath her had already been claimed, that the house of cards she was so proud of had been bought and paid for by the very person she'd spent her life dismissing. And the most devastating part wasn't the betrayal. It was the fact that she never even saw it coming. For a moment after Grandpa's question landed, his simple, pointed inquiry that sliced through the last veil of delusion Rachel had been clinging to, the room held its breath in that particular way only a family dining room can, when love, pride, guilt, and years of unspoken resentment all collide under the soft glow of an overhead chandelier and the scent of cinnamon and poultry still clinging to the air like a memory that refuses to fade. I watched her face first freeze, then shift, slowly, like ice beginning to crack under weight it had never been built to hold, her eyes darting from Grandpa to me, then back to the untouched plate of stuffing she'd been so proud of just minutes earlier, as if somehow it could offer refuge from a truth too sharp to look at directly. No one else said a word, which, in our family, meant everything. My mother blinked rapidly, eyes moving between the two of us like a referee suddenly realizing the game she thought she'd been controlling had, in fact, been rigged from the very beginning. My father cleared his throat, but offered nothing useful, no defense, no denial. Just a hollow, uncomfortable glance downward as though if he focused hard enough on the tablecloth, this entire conversation might evaporate. Jake shifted in his seat like a man realizing too late that he'd brought a water pistol to a gunfight, suddenly aware that the woman he'd been dating might not be quite who he thought she was, or worse, that he'd simply never asked the right questions. But Rachel, she did what she always did when faced with something she couldn't spin, something she couldn't seduce or laugh her way out of or manipulate into a prettier shape. She lashed out, not loudly, not theatrically, but with that trembling voice fury that comes from being caught completely unprepared, her mouth opening as if to accuse, to deny, to reclaim the narrative, but no sound coming out except a thin, breathless, "What are you talking about?" And it was in that moment, so naked, so vulnerable, so raw, that I should have stopped, should have offered her a way out, should have softened the blow that was already bruising every part of her carefully curated ego. But I didn't. Because I'd waited too long, swallowed too many slights, endured too many years of being underestimated, dismissed, reduced to a collection of job titles and earnings figures, and oh, she's just good at school, while she was celebrated for simply surviving her own chaos. So I met her stare head-on, my voice calm, even warm, as I replied, I didn't want to bring business to the table today. It's Thanksgiving. But I suppose grandpas earn the right to ask hard questions. I let the silence stretch again, not for drama, but because I wanted her to fill it with the thoughts that had to be colliding in her head, the late emails that came from unfamiliar addresses, the client who suddenly appeared just when she needed one, the quiet but inexplicable shift in her company's financial security. And when she didn't speak, when her mouth remained slightly open and her fingers dug nervously into the edge of her linen napkin, I offered the final stroke with a softness that only made it sting more. You didn't lose your company, Rachel. You just sold it. You just never looked hard enough at who was buying. It was my mother who finally broke the silence, her voice brittle and too high, saying something about dessert, about coffee, trying to yank the room back into a semblance of order. But the illusion had shattered. The performance was over. Rachel stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the hardwood floor in a sound that made the dog bark from the hallway, her face pale and eyes glassy, though no tears had yet appeared. She didn't say my name, didn't curse, didn't yell. Just looked at me the way someone might look at a stranger who had read their diary out loud to a crowd, and then she turned and walked out, past the kitchen, down the hallway. The sound of the front door opening and closing with the finality of something far heavier than wood and hinges. Jake, to his minimal credit, stood and mumbled something about checking on her, though his voice lacked commitment. I don't think he followed her. I think he just wanted to escape the debris. My mother sat stunned, one hand gripping the arm of her chair as if she feared the house itself might collapse next, while my father muttered something under his breath about never airing this kind of thing at dinner, and Grandpa, God bless him, just reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, and nodded once in my direction, not in triumph, but in quiet understanding. He was the only one who seemed unsurprised, and perhaps that's because he, like me, had seen this coming a long time ago. Later that evening, long after the plates had been cleared and the candles blown out and the rest of the family scattered like leaves in the wind, I stood alone in the hallway looking at the family portrait Mom still kept by the stairs, taken years ago. Back when Rachel and I were both pretending to like each other, back when we still believed we might grow into women who were different from the girls we had been. In the photo, we're standing side by side, both smiling, both angled slightly toward the camera in the way young women are trained to pose without even thinking about it, and for a brief second, I felt something that I hadn't expected, not victory. Not satisfaction, but a dull ache of something resembling grief. Not for the loss of a sister, because I'm not sure we were ever truly sisters in the way people mean it, but for the loss of the illusion that we might someday become that. Maybe I had wanted her to understand. Maybe I had wanted her to apologize. Maybe, underneath all the layers of control and strategy, I'd still been hoping she would finally look at me and see not the competitor, not the enemy, not the benchmark to resent, but just the woman who had spent her whole life waiting for her to show up and be real. But she hadn't. And maybe she never would. An hour later, I got a text from Jeremy, short, clipped, passive in the way only a man trying to appear neutral can be. It read, "You didn't have to do that." I didn't reply, because I had done exactly what I had to do. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because at some point, someone had to stop pretending that silence was kindness, that letting Rachel live inside her own myth was the merciful thing. Maybe it had been cruel. Maybe I was the villain in her version of the story. But I also knew the truth. I hadn't destroyed anything that hadn't already been broken. I'd just stopped holding the pieces together for her. As I drove home, the roads quiet under the weight of the first winter frost, I replayed Grandpa's voice in my head, steady, sharp, surgical, and I wondered if he'd asked the question for me, or for her. Maybe for both. When I pulled into my driveway, the motion sensor lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the hood of my car, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I needed to explain myself. Not to Rachel. Not to my parents. Not to anyone. And yet, as I stood on the porch, key in hand, wind picking up just enough to make the leaves dance across the pavement like ghosts, I found myself whispering a question to the night, not expecting an answer. Just releasing it because some questions don't need to be solved to be real. Was it mercy, I asked the darkness, or just the cleanest kind of revenge? There was no reply. Just silence. The kind that doesn't judge. The kind that leaves room for the truth to echo back when you're ready to hear it.